Hello and welcome. He was standing next to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he was assassinated in April of 1968 and went on to become one of the leading campaigners for African American rights. Often embracing controversy to achieve results, he negotiated the release of hostages on the international stage and even ran for the office of US President. This week on One-on-One, meet the leading American civil rights activist, Reverend Jesse Jackson. His larger-than-life personality and energy has made him one of the most prominent political figures in the USA, but it was the experience of his early years that made Jesse Jackson the tough survivor he is today. Born illegitimately to a poor unwed teenage student, he soon learned to fight his corner, helped by his determination and large athletic physique, making him a prominent athlete during his school years. His activism started during college, and by 1965, Jackson had joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in fighting for the rights of African Americans at a pivotal time in the country's history. Following the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, Jackson continued his fight for civil rights, even becoming a prominent contender in the U.S. presidential races in 1984 and 1988. In recent years, he's focused on the Rainbow Push coalition he founded, remaining publicly visible and trying to lend support when issues arise, and continuing to speak out for civil and human rights, both in the USA and internationally. Reverend Jesse Jackson, a pleasure speaking with you.
To you, sir.
You've got almost half a century of activism. You started young, you've become arguably the most visible civil rights leader in America. Has it made it easier for your voice to be heard, or is America still a little deaf when it comes to...
Well, America's changing. I came home from school in 1959 and tried to use a public library, and I was turned away. And I became very insulted by it, and that summer, a group of classmates, we went back to the library. We were arrested July 16, 1960, trying to use a public library. Today, it's about reconciliation and building bridges, but the walls, the walls of legal apartheid were very vicious in our country. The day Dr. King gave the speech in Washington, it's called I Have a Dream speech. On that day, from Texas across to Florida, up to Maryland, we couldn't use a single public toilet. We lived under the ugliness of that system. For most of us, we couldn't be police or firemen, and because we didn't have the right to vote, there were hardly any elected black officials at that time. We tore down those walls. And then, as we moved toward evolution of making America what it is today, we began to transform the whole culture. What you see today is a result of 54 years of intense battles to change the culture.
Let me take you back to when America was a very different place. You were born in Greenville, South Carolina, just before World War II. What do you recall of that time and how different America was?
Well, I never saw an African-American policeman or fireman as a child growing up. Black teachers made less money than white teachers by law. We had to go to school double shift, that is 8 to 12, 12 to 4, because there was not enough room in the school for us to go to. No black could sell clothes in a downtown clothing store. It was just rigid racial separation. But we changed those laws, and that's the good news. America is growing and changing.
You described some of those things you went through as a child, how there was such strict segregation. How was your childhood, though? Were you able to have some sort of a life where you felt that at least you had some kind of fun, some kind of normality?
Yeah, you know what it is? Even in segregation, you learn to live within your world, and you blank the bigger world out. Within our little world, we had our own church and school and athletic teams. We learned to live in our world. But our world was so limited. In our world, there was no vote in that world. There was no black businesses to mention in that world. We could not dream of becoming mayor or governor or senator or president from that world. So it is but somehow, at some point, a minority can have a majority vision. You can dream beyond your little world. That's the genius, it seems to me, of Moses and Dr. King and Mandela, was that they dreamed beyond the world that was designed for them.
As a kid, how were you able to relate to that, though? Did it come into your mind that things were so?
No. At that time, it really was about survival. Like, you know, be respectful and don't be respectful and don't degrade, don't self-degrade. Do not engage in activities that will destroy you. Learn to read, write, and count. Education is the way out. Strong minds break strong chains. If we keep pushing, one day the walls will come down. But you really are in a rather defensive survival mode. In reflection, what comes to me the most is how limited our dreams were. I mean, most of my high school senior classmates got married that summer. Going to college was not even part of their world. There was no college blacks could go to in that area, and people couldn't afford to send them to college. So if you were finished high school and you didn't get in trouble and you married your high school sweetheart and you had children, got you a job, and most of my class were still living in that world even today. They never broke out of the boundaries of the world established for them by the system.
What were the qualities your mother, Helen, had to survive what she went through in terms of to be able to get, she was a teenage 17-year-old who had an unmarried woman who had a child. She had you as a child. What were the strengths, the qualities you think she had?
Well, I think much of it came from my grandmother, who gave her a competent and secure zone. She a very bright student. She married when I was 1, so I was never fatherless. She went back to school and got a degree as a cosmetologist. She had her own business, she had a great sense of self-determination, a sense of business, a very staunch church-going woman, strong religious values. And so I felt a security that came out of my home. And my father, who adopted me, was a great athlete. And so much of my athletic pursuits came from
Charles.
Came from that relationship. And then my world, I mean, they kept arguing, if we don't self-destruct and don't self-degrade, and they can't unlearn you once you learn to read and write and count and think. And at some point in time, breakthroughs will come your way. And I think really early on, my teachers, some of them embraced me as having some sense of destiny I couldn't realize. So we had along the way these very able teachers who believed that some way, somehow, one day, we could change that system if we in fact if we persevered.
I read how some of your teachers described you as someone who was strong, competitive, had some leadership qualities that they felt that you would go somewhere because you were competitive and you had that spirit. Now, what do you think that drove that into you? Because obviously you had that respect and everything from your home environment.
I had other classmates. It seemed so normal to me. Some classmates had that extra drive and others seemed to have adjusted to our situation. But then I had help along the way. I mean, because my father was a baseball player, I met Jackie Robinson early on. I began to admire Dr. King early on, and began to admire Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was his mentor early on. My interest began to grow in that direction, Riz. And I met Dr. King in '64, and by '65 we were in Selma. I joined his staff and worked with him to '68, and so being with him was a transformative season because he saw the world in such bigger terms than any of us ever thought of.
Just a footnote on your childhood, though. Your real father, your genetic father, I should say, was a very wealthy man in Greenville.
He was wealthy. He had a stable job. He was a cotton sampler. He had been a boxer. He had some prestige, no money.
Did you have a relationship with him at all?
I did. And so to that extent, I had two fathers. My father and my who adopted me, and my natural father were friends. They became friends. And both of them had a kind of common love for me. And so I kind of had the shared love of the both of them. But he was a bigger-than-life guy, And so I think about him with very fond memories.
Now, your time in college, you were a good athlete. To the point where you basketball, baseball, and American football as well. I mean, you're rated. Was there an option for you to have that kind of career? Was it something you thought about seriously?
Well, in baseball, I went to a tryout camp in '59. I was the only African-American allowed to go to the camp. But between the paltry amount offered for a bonus, a chance to go to college and play football and graduate from college, became a bigger, better dream, and I'm glad I made that decision at that time. But I had a rather accomplished career in high school as a baseball player and a football player, and I chose to go to college because I got a scholarship. I went to college, I never paid tuition, because I always earned my way through scholarships.
What made you move closer to the church? You became a Baptist minister in 1968.
Well, I grew up in a very church-oriented family life, learned to admire preachers, and when it came time to fight that system, it was basically led by ministers and led by lawyers. And I was torn when I would become a minister. I become a lawyer. I remember the first time we were planning to go to jail to open up the public library, and we left Reverend James Hall organizing and sent us there. We went to jail. They knew we were coming. The police were there. And he said, if you don't leave, we're going to arrest you. So we went back to the church. Reverend Hall said, why are you guys back so quick? We said, they were going to arrest us. He said, I sent you there to get arrested. We went back, we got arrested. We were protesting that situation, but ministers at their best had that kind of vision, that kind of leadership. But of course, the lawyers bailed us out. The lawyers argued our case. Because when the 54 Supreme Court decision was passed to end legal segregation, there was 10 years of test cases. Montgomery bus boycott was a legal test case. The 57 Little Rock 9 confrontation was a test case. Our going to jail was a test case. We finally turned that into the 64 public accommodation bills where we use all facilities everywhere. But we were part of that testing of bringing down that wall, lay the groundwork for the bridges that we're now seeing being crossed.
I want to ask you more about those defining moments in your work as a civil rights activist in those years in just a moment. We're pausing for a short break here. We're back more with Reverend Jesse Jackson in a moment.